Hi. So I missed maybe 2 days, maybe just one day. I've had a little bit to drink because it's Friday and we had a happy hour. And this week has not been great. And I don't need to go into that because this is not the Mike Bevel Kvetch's video series, but this is Footnotes with your good friend Mike Bevel. And we're reading Middlemarch. And we are up to chapter 9. And chapter 9 is kind of long. So, yeah, we're going to be with each other for a while for this one. And let's see how I do. So we open with an epigram. First gentleman. An ancient land in ancient oracles is called law-thirsty. All the struggle there was after order and a perfect rule. Pray where lie such lands now? Second gentleman. Why, where they lay of old, in human souls. We'll keep that in mind, I guess, but I don't know. I mean, some things can make sense to you and then maybe not make sense to anyone else. It's just how the world works. And maybe this made sense to George Eliot for this chapter. And maybe if I can keep it in mind, by the time I get to the end, it'll make sense why it's there. Mr. Casaubon's behavior about settlements was highly satisfactory to Mr. Brooke, and the preliminaries of marriage rolled smoothly along. If I just got louder, it's because I moved the microphone closer. Shortening the weeks of courtship, the betrothed bride must see her future home and dictate any changes that she would like to have made there. A woman dictates before marriage in order that she may have an appetite for submission afterwards. That's an interesting sentence, isn't it? And certainly the mistakes that we male and female mortals make when we have our own way might fairly let's try that again. A woman dictates before marriage in order that she may have an appetite for submission afterwards. And certainly, the mistakes that we male and female mortals make when we have our own way might fairly raise some wonder that we are so fond of it. On a gray but dry November morning, Dorothea drove to Lowick in company with her uncle and Celia. So just one thing I want to point out right now is it's interesting that Dorothea, her marriage appears to be settled either for the fall or winter. So when we talk about Casaubon as a vampire or as a leech of some kind, the fact that this marriage is happening in the fall or winter takes on even more significance because it's not a spring, she's not a spring bride. This isn't sort of a fresh love. Eliot seems to be kind of signaling to us that this is a dry, dying love. Spoiler alert. On a gray but dry November morning, Dorothea drove to Lowick in company with her uncle and Celia. Mr. Casaubon's home was the manor house. Close by, visible from some parts of the garden, was the little church with the old parsonage opposite. In the beginning of his career, Mr. Casaubon had only held the living, but the death of his brother had put him in possession of the manor also. So that term, the living, so what would happen is you as the parson of a church would receive rents from people who were renting the land that the church owned. So your income would come both from tithes that your parishioners would give and then from rents. So, and this actually becomes a little bit of an issue for Patrick Bronte, the father of the Bronte sisters and Branwell Bronte, who is not a sister but a brother, who had an affair with a woman named Mrs. Robinson, because art isn't complicated enough. Anyway, so Patrick Bronte received money in the form of, what was given during collection and then also from rents. And when he was trying to get remarried because his first wife had died of tuberculosis, he wrote to an old flame and just said, by the way, I've got this living, sort of trying to prove to the mother and his prospective bride, who turned him down, by the way, that he had money coming in. So that's just what a living is. Mr. Casaubon had only held the living, but the death of his brother had put him in possession of the manor also. It had a small park with a fine old oak here and there, and an avenue of limes toward the southwest front with a sunk fence between park and pleasure ground. So that from the drawing room windows, let's try that sentence again. So from the drawing room windows, the glance swept uninterruptedly along a slope of greensward till the limes ended in a level of corn and pastures, which often seemed to melt into a lake under the setting sun. This was the happy side of the house, for the south and east looked rather melancholy even under the brightest morning. The grounds here were more confined. The flower bed showed no very careful tendance, and large clumps of trees, chiefly of somber hues, had risen high not 10 yards from the window. The building of greenish stone was in the old English style, not ugly, but small-windowed and melancholy looking, the sort of house that must have children, many flowers, open windows, and little vistas of bright things to make it seem a joyous home. In this letter of autumn, with a sparse remnant of yellow leaves falling slowly athwart the dark evergreens in a stillness without sunshine, the house too had an air of autumnal decline, and Mr. Casaubon, when he presented himself, had no bloom that could be thrown into relief by that background. So, I mean, he's a vampire. I know he's not a vampire, but boy, is George Eliot making the case for him being a vampire. Like, if you wanted to rewrite this and Casaubon was a vampire, geh gesund. Oh dear, Celia said to herself. I'm sure Freshet Hall would have been pleasanter than this. She thought of the white freestone, the pillared portico, and the terrace full of flowers. Sir James smiling above them like a prince issuing from his enchantment in a rose bush, with a handkerchief swiftly metamorphed from the most delicately odorous petals. Sir James, who talked so agreeably always about things which had common sense in them, and not about learning. Did I read that correctly? That doesn't. I'm going to try that paragraph again. Bear with me. Let's rewind. No editing. Oh dear, Celia said to herself. I am sure Freshet Hall would have been pleasanter than this. She thought of the white freestone, the pillared portico, and the terrace full of flowers, Sir James smiling above them like a prince issuing from his enchantment in a rose bush, with a handkerchief swiftly metamorphed from the most delicately odorous petals. Sir James, who talked so agreeably about things which had common sense in them, and not about learning. Celia had those light, young, feminine tastes which grave and weather-worn gentlemen sometimes prefer in a wife. But happily, Mr. Casaubon's bias had been different, for he would have had no chance with Celia. Dorothea, on the contrary, found the house and grounds all that she could wish. The dark bookshelves in the long library, the carpets and curtains with colors subdued by time, the curious old maps and bird's eye view on the walls of the corridor, and here and there an old vase below had no oppression for her and seemed more cheerful than the casts and pictures of the Grange, which her uncle had long ago brought from his travels, they being probably among the ideas he had taken in at one time. To poor Dorothea, these severe classical nudities and smirking Renaissance courageosities were painfully inexplicable. staring into the midst of her puritanic conceptions, she had never been taught how she could bring them into any sort of relevance with her life. But the owners of Lowick apparently had not been travelers, and Mr. Casaubon's studies of the past were not carried on by means of such aids. So what we're learning about Mr. Brooke here is fascinating. He has porn in his house, and he has legit porn in the form of classical painting, which is one way Victorians could get around this idea of the necessity of propriety. Like, if it's a nude from a classic Greek or Roman story, who are we to deny that that's how it looked? So you could display naked ladies, and a lot of people displayed naked ladies. I'm going to pause just for one moment. I usually don't do this, but I'm going to pause because I have an IM from a colleague. Hi, I'm back. It wasn't the satisfying response I had hoped, but it was fine. Anyway, Mr. Brooke has porn up. One of the few ways you can is by having it be classical. Let's see. Dorothea walked about the house with delightful emotion. Everything seemed hallowed to her. This was to be the home of her wifehood, and she looked up with eyes full of confidence to Mr. Casaubon when he drew her attention specially to some actual arrangements and asked her if she would like an alteration. All appeals to her taste she met gratefully, but she saw nothing to alter. His efforts at exact courtesy and formal tenderness had no defect for her. She filled up all blanks with unmanifested perfections, interpreting him as she interpreted the words of Providence, and accounting for seeming discords by her own deafness to the higher harmonies. And there are many blanks left in the weeks of courtship, which a loving faith fills with happy assurance. Now, my dear Dorothea, I wish you to favor me by pointing out which room you would like to have as your boudoir, said Mr. Casaubon, showing that his views of the womanly nature were sufficiently large to include that requirement. Well, it is very kind of you to think of that, said Dorothea, but I assure you I would rather have all those matters decided for me. Does that sound like our Dorothea, by the way? Or does that sound like someone placating a man? I shall be much happier to take everything as it is, just as you have been used to have it, or as you will yourself choose it to be. I have no motive for wishing anything else. Oh, Dodo, said Celia, will you not have the bow-windowed room upstairs? Mr. Casaubon led the way thither. The bow window looked down the avenue of limes. The furniture was all of a faded blue, and there were miniatures of ladies and gentlemen with powdered hair hanging in a group. A piece of tapestry over a door also showed a blue-green world with a pale stag in it. The chairs and tables were thin-legged and easy to upset. It was a room where one might fancy the ghost of a tight-laced lady revisiting the scene of her embroidery. A light bookcase contained 12 volumes of polite literature in calf, completing the furniture. So just another, really quick thing. If you're reading a 19th century novel and you're not sure if the family is rich or not, if they have a library, they're rich. Books were expensive, and leather-bound books were fucking expensive. So that's how you know people are comfortable, or people have money to spare. Yes, said Mr. Brooke, this would be a pretty room with some new hangings, sofas, and that sort of thing. A little bare now. No, uncle, said Dorothea eagerly. Pray do not speak of altering anything. There are so many other things in the world that want altering. I like to take these things as they are. And you like them as they are, don't you? She added, looking at Mr. Casaubon. Perhaps this was your mother's room when she was young. It was, he said, with his slow bend of the head. This is your mother, said Dorothea, who had turned to examine the group of miniatures. It is like the tiny one you brought me, only I should think a better portrait. And this one opposite, who is this? Her elder sister. They were, like you and your sister, the only two children of their parents who hang above them, you see. The sister is pretty, said Celia, implying that she thought less favorably of Mr. Casaubon's mother. It was a new opening to Celia's imagination, that he came of a family who had all been young in their time, the ladies wearing necklaces. It is a peculiar face, said Dorothea, looking closely. Those deep gray eyes rather near together, and the delicate, irregular nose with a sort of ripple in it, and all the powdered curls hanging backward. Altogether, it seems to me altogether it seems peculiar rather than pretty. This is not even a family likeness between her and your mother. No, and they were not alike in their lot. You did not mention her to me, said Dorothea. My aunt made an unfortunate marriage. I never saw her. Dorothea wondered a little, but felt that it would be indelicate just then to ask for any information which Mr. Casaubon did not proffer, and she turned to the window to admire the view. The sun had lately pierced the gray, and the avenue of limes cast shadows. Shall we not walk in the garden now? Said Dorothea. And you would like to see the church, you know, said Mr. Brooke. It is a droll little church, and the village. It all lies in a nutshell. By the way, it will suit you, Dorothea, for the cottages are like a row of almshouses, little gardens, gillyflowers, that sort of thing. Yes, please, said Dorothea, looking at Mr. Casaubon. I should like to see all that. She had got nothing from him more graphic about the Lowick cottages than that they were, quote, not bad. They were soon on a gravel walk which led chiefly between grassy borders and clumps of trees, this being the nearest way to the church. Sorry, I read that wrong. They were soon on a gravel walk which led chiefly between grassy borders and clumps of trees, this being the nearest way to the church, Mr. Casaubon said. At the little gate leading into the churchyard, there was a pause while Mr. Casaubon went to the parsonage close by to fetch a key. Celia, who had been hanging a little in the rear, came up presently when she saw that Mr. Casaubon was gone away, and said in her easy staccato, which always seemed to contradict the suspicion of any malicious intent, Do you know, Dorothea, I saw someone quite young coming up one of the walks. Is that astonishing? Is that astonishing, Celia? There may be a young gardener, you know. Why not? Said Mr. Brooke. I told Mr. Casaubon he should change his gardener. No, not a gardener, said Celia. A gentleman with a sketchbook. He had light brown curls. I only saw his back, but he was quite young, as opposed to Casaubon, who is 45, and I am 48. I forgot my husband's birthday. It's July 21st. I thought it was June 21st. So June 21st, which is Father's Day, I came down and said happy birthday, and now he thinks I have Alzheimer's. Let's see. The curate's son, perhaps, said Mr. Brooke. Ah, there is Casaubon again, and Tucker with him. He is going to introduce you to Tucker. You don't know Tucker yet. Mr. Tucker was a middle-aged curate, one of the inferior clergy who are usually not wanting in sons. But after the introduction, the conversation did not lead to any questions about his family, and the startling apparition of youthfulness was forgotten by everyone but Celia. She inwardly declined to believe that the light brown curls and slim figure could have any relationship to Mr. Tucker, who was just as old and musty looking as she would have expected Mr. Casaubon's curate to be. Doubtless an excellent man who would go to heaven, for Celia wished not to be unprincipled. But the corners of his mouth were so unpleasant. Celia thought with some dismalness of the time she would have to spend as a bridesmaid at Lowick, where the curate had probably no pretty little children whom she could like, irrespective of principle. Mr. Tucker was invaluable in their walk, and perhaps Mr. Casaubon had not been without foresight on this head, the curate being able to answer all Dorothea's questions about the villagers and the other parishioners. Everybody, he assured her, was well off in Lowick, not a cottager in those double cottages at a low rent, but kept a pig, and the strips of garden at the back were well tended. The small boys wore excellent corduroy. The girls went out as tidy servants or did a little straw plaiting at home. No looms here, no dissent. So here there's a footnote. Dissent means separation from the established church. It includes Methodism and evangelicalism. And George Eliot is very interested in the Methodists. She explores them a lot in her first novel, Adam Bede. Where did we leave off? And though the public disposition was rather towards laying by money than towards spirituality, there was not much vice. The speckled fowls were so numerous that Mr. Brooke observed, "Your farmers leave some barley for the women to glean, I see. The poor folk here might have a fowl in their pot, so the good French king used to wish for all his people. The French eat a good many fowl, skinny fowls, you know." "I think it was a very cheap wish of his," said Dorothea indignantly. "Are kings such monsters that a wish like that must be reckoned a royal virtue?" "And if he wished them a skinny fowl," said Celia, "that would not be nice. But perhaps he wished them to have fat fowls." "Yes, but the word is dropped out of the text, or perhaps was sub adatum, that is, present in the king's mind but not uttered," said Mr. Casaubon, smiling and bending his head towards Celia, who immediately dropped backward a little because she could not bear Mr. Casaubon to blink at her. Dorothea sank into silence on the way back to the house. She felt some disappointment, of which she was yet ashamed, that there was nothing for her to do in Lowick, and in the next few minutes her mind had glanced over the possibility, which she would have preferred, of finding that her home would be in a parish which had a larger share of the world's misery, so that she might have had more active duties in it. So she wants to be helpful, and she's disappointed that this is a place that doesn't need help. The help you want to give may not always be the help that is needed. Then recurring to the future, actually before her, she made a picture of a more complete devotion to Mr. Casaubon's aims, in which she would await new duties. Many such might reveal themselves to the higher knowledge gained by her in that companionship. Mr. Tucker soon left them, having some clerical work which would not allow him to lunch at the hall, and as they were re-entering the garden through the little gate, Mr. Casaubon said, "You seem a little sad, Dorothea. I trust you are pleased with what you have seen." "I am feeling something which is perhaps foolish and wrong," answered Dorothea with her usual openness, "almost wishing that the people wanted more to be done for them here. I have known so few ways of making my life good for anything. Of course, my notions of usefulness must be narrow. I must learn new ways of helping people." "Doubtless," said Mr. Casaubon. "Each position has its corresponding duties. Yours, I trust, as the mistress of Lowick, will not leave any yearning unfulfilled. We might be talking about a difference of desire here, because what Dorothea wants is to be important and helpful, and what Casaubon wants is for her to take care of him in the house." Let's see. Indeed, I believe that, said Dorothea earnestly. Do not suppose that I am sad. All right, that was my brother clearing his throat, if you heard that. That is well, but if you are not tired, we will take another way to the house than that by which we came. Dorothea was not tired at all, and a little circuit was made toward a fine yew tree, the chief hereditary glory of the grounds on this side of the house. As they approached it, a figure conspicuous on a dark background of evergreens was seated on a bench sketching the old tree. Mr. Brooke, who was walking in front with Celia, turned his head and said, "Who is that youngster, Casaubon?" They had come very near when Mr. Casaubon answered, "That is a young relative of mine, second cousin, the grandson, in fact," he added, looking at Dorothea, of the lady whose portrait you have been noticing, my Aunt Julia." The young man had laid down his sketchbook and risen. His bushy light brown curls, as well as his youthfulness, identified him at once with Celia's apparition. "Dorothea, let me introduce you to my cousin, Mr. Ladislaw. Will, this is Miss Brooke." The cousin was so close now that when he lifted his hat, Dorothea could see a pair of gray eyes rather near together, a delicate, irregular nose with a little ripple in it, and hair falling backwards. But there was a mouth and a chin of a more prominent, threatening aspect that belonged to the type of the grandmother's miniature. Young Ladislaw did not feel it necessary to smile, as if he were charmed with the introduction in his future second cousin and her relatives, but wore rather a pouting air of discontent. "You are an artist, I see," said Mr. Brooke, taking up the sketchbook and turning it over in his unceremonious fashion. I feel like picking up an artist's sketchbook and flipping through it is sort of the same rudeness as taking a gay man's phone and flipping through his photos. Don't do that. You're going to see stuff you weren't prepared for, and you're going to want an explanation. And the gay guy may not be interested in giving you an explanation. Yeah, you got yourself in that mess. You need to get yourself out of that mess. "No, I only sketch a little. This is nothing fit to be seen here," said young Ladislaw, coloring, perhaps with temper rather than modesty. "Oh, come, this is a nice bit now. I did a little in this way myself at one time, you know. Look here now, this is what I call a nice thing, done with what we used to call brio." Mr. Brooke held out towards the two girls a large colored sketch of stony ground and trees with a pool. Let me turn this light on. Just so I can see better, because I am the age of Casaubon. And if I had Dorothea to read this out loud, then I wouldn't have to. Where are we? "I am no judge of these things," said Dorothea, not coldly, but with an eager deprecation of the appeal to her. "You know, uncle, I never see the beauty of those pictures which you say are much praised. They are a language I do not understand. I suppose there is some relation between pictures and natures which I am too ignorant to feel, just as you see what a Greek sentence stands for, which means nothing to me." Dorothea looked up at Mr. Casaubon, who bowed his head towards her, while Mr. Brooke said, smiling nonchalantly, "Bless me now, how different people are. But you had a bad style of teaching, you know, else this is just the thing for girls, sketching, fine art, and so on. But you took to drawing plans. You don't understand morbidezza, which is a term popular with 18th century art critics to describe that style of painting characterized by extreme delicacy and softness. So I am no closer to understanding what that term means than when we started. If it means something to you, tell me what it means." You will come to my house, I hope, and I will show you what I did in this way, he continued, turning toward Ladislaw, who had to be recalled from his preoccupation in observing Dorothea. Ladislaw had made up his mind that she must be an unpleasant girl, since she was going to marry Casaubon, and what she said of her stupidity about pictures would have confirmed that opinion, even if he had believed her. As it was, he took her words for a covert judgment and was certain that she thought his sketch detestable. There was too much cleverness in her apology. She was laughing both at her uncle and himself. But what a voice! It was like the voice of a soul that had once lived in an Aeolian harp. This must be one of nature's inconsistencies. There could be no sort of passion in a girl who would marry Casaubon. But he turned from her and bowed his thanks for Mr. Brooks's invitation. We will turn over my Italian engravings together, continued that good-natured man. I have no end of those things that I have laid by for years. One gets rusty in this part of the country, you know. Not you, Casaubon. You stick to your studies, but my best ideas get undermost out of use, you know. You clever young men must guard against indolence. I was too indolent, you know, else I might have been anywhere at one time. That is a seasonable admonition, said Mr. Casaubon, but now we will pass on to the house, lest the young lady should be tired of standing. When their backs were turned, young Ladislaw sat down to go on with his sketching, and as he did so, his face broke into an expression of amusement which increased as he went on drawing, till at last he threw back his head and laughed aloud. Partly it was the reception of his own artistic production that tickled him, partly the notion of his grave cousin as the lover of that girl, and partly Mr. Brooks's definition of the place he might have held, but for the impediment of indolence. Mr. Will Ladislaw's sense of the ludicrous lit up his features very agreeably. It was the pure enjoyment of comicality, and had no mixture of sneering and self-exhalation. What is your nephew going to do with himself, Casaubon? Said Mr. Brooke, as they went on. My cousin, you mean, not my nephew. Yes, yes, cousin. But in the way of a career, you know. The answer to that question is painfully doubtful. On leaving Rugby, he declined to go to an English university where I would gladly have placed him, and chose what I must consider the anomalous course of studying at Heidelberg. And now he wants to go abroad again without any special object, save the vague purpose of what he calls culture, preparations for he knows not what. He declines to choose a profession. He has no means but what you furnish, I suppose. I have always given him and his friends reason to understand that I would furnish in moderation what was necessary for providing him with a scholarly education and launching him respectably. I am therefore bound to fulfill the expectation so raised, said Mr. Casaubon, putting his conduct in the light of a mere rectitude, a trait of delicacy which Dorothea noticed with admiration. He has a thirst for traveling. Perhaps he may turn out a Bruce or a Mungo Park, said Mr. Brooke. They were explorers of Africa, colonizers of Africa, because this book is not quite explicit enough about the terrible things England is doing. Any moment you catch it. No, he has no bent toward exploration or the enlargement of our geonosis. That would be a special purpose which I could recognize with some approbation, though without felicitating him on a career which so often ends in premature and violent death. But so far is he from having any desire for a more accurate knowledge of the earth's surface that he said he should prefer not to know the source of the Nile, and that there should be some unknown regions preserved as hunting grounds for the poetic imagination. This is me in planets, by the way. Like, I'm just not interested in planets. Great sweat stain. Keep it. There's just too many. Like there's 9 or 10 or 9 or 11 or 9. They're always discovering another one. I saw a Star Wars once with too many planets, and I actually like there was one scene that was so brightly lit that I was able to read my book for a while and just escape the Star Wars. Too many stars and too many wars and too many planets, and I couldn't keep up. So I get it. I feel it in my being. Let's see. Well, there is something in that, said Mr. Brooke, who had certainly an impartial mind. It is, I fear, nothing more than a part of his general inaccuracy and indisposition to thoroughness of all kind, which would be a bad augury for him in any profession, civil or sacred, even were he so far submissive to ordinary rule as to choose one. Perhaps he has conscious scruples founded on his own unfitness, said Dorothea, who was interesting herself in finding a favorable explanation. Because the law and medicine should be very serious professions to undertake, should they not? People's lives and fortunes depend on them. Doubtless, but I fear that my young relative Will Ladislaw is chiefly determined in his aversion to these callings by a dislike to steady application, and to that kind of acquirement which is needful instrumentally, but is not charming or immediately inviting to self-indulgent taste. I have insisted to him on what Aristotle had stated with admirable brevity, that for the achievement of any work regarded as an end, there must be a prior exercise of many energies or acquired facilities of a secondary order, demanding patience. I have pointed to my own manuscript volumes, which represent the toil of years preparatory to a work not yet accomplished, but in vain. To careful reasoning of this kind, he replies by calling himself Pegasus, in every form of prescribed work, harness. Celia laughed. She was surprised to find that Mr. Casaubon could say something quite amusing. Well, he may turn out a Byron, a Chatterton, a Churchill, that sort of thing. There's no telling, said Mr. Brooke. Shall you let him go to Italy or wherever he wants to go? Yes. I have agreed to furnish him with moderate supplies for a year or so. He asks no more. I shall let him be tired by the test of freedom. That is very kind of you, said Dorothea, looking up at Mr. Casaubon with delight. It is noble. After all, people may really have in them some vocation which is not quite plain to themselves, may they not? They may seem idle and weak because they are growing. I think we're getting a little bit of a hint of what George Eliot might be arguing about. And again, it harkens back to the prelude about having to find your own passion and also finding a chronicler of that passion in order to be important. Anyway, I suppose it is being engaged to be married that has made you think patience good, said Celia, as soon as she and Dorothea were alone together, taking off their wrappings. You mean that I am very impatient, Celia? Yes, when people don't do and say just what you like. Celia had become less afraid of saying things to Dorothea since this engagement. Cleverness seemed to her more pitiable than ever. And that's chapter 9. We did it. We missed some days, and that's going to happen. Life is going to get in my way. Life is going to get in your way. Life is going to get in all of our ways. And then it moves out of the way. But the point is, I read another chapter. You did or did not watch it. I can't tell. I don't know if people are enjoying this. I'm enjoying it. I like reading out loud, it turns out. I'm trying to get better at it. But that's it. So now we do that thing where I try to find how to see. You saw my eyes dart down, didn't you? And then I press this, and then I press this, and we say goodbye to each other.